I'm Florin Pasatoiu from the Center for Foreign Policy and Security Studies from University of Craiova. Our guest today is Lucca Ratti from Roma III University, Italy. Welcome, Luca.
Thank you, Florin.
Luca, our first question today would be a broad one, and that relates very much to the changing nature of the international system structure. And since we've been witnessing a shift in the modes of production and in the modes of power, in the sense that this is playing out to the rest of the world, that has become all of a sudden relevant, although some people would argue that this sort of transition has started some time back to the 18th centuries. And we know that with this kind of transitions, multipolarity may be back in town. And we know also that with multipolarity, great powers' rivalry becomes the name of the game. How would you translate the shifting structure in terms of having an impact upon the security environment in Europe? And I would just paraphrasing an old statement. Since the Germans are not down, as the Americans are out, and as Russians have been already in, but it seems to me that there is a new entrant, China, that would be gladly filling in the vacuum left behind by the US. How is Europe supposed to respond to such a changing security environment?
That's a very complex question, Christian. Well, I believe that Europe has been at the center of international politics for centuries. And even at the early stages of the transformation at the end of the Cold War, Europe was still playing a central, a fundamental role. After all, the Cold War collapsed in Europe. The bipolar structure of international politics imploded in Europe. And this created huge hopes that maybe the European model and its offspring, the American model, could become like the new universal model. There were calls back in the days for this to become the end of history. And it only took, though, a few years to understand that history had not come to an end. And actually the collapse of bipolarity and the acceleration of globalization that happened as a result of bipolarity would bring us back on the edge of history, as new powers would now arise pretty much to challenge, well, first of all, to be integrated into the European model, but then to challenge also that model. And I think this is what has been happening now for a number of years. Of course, this process has been accelerating, of course, with the rise of China, with the formation a few years ago of the BRICS, and the new significance that this places for all the structure of international relations, for all the powers such as Europe, but also for Euro-Atlantic institutions. So Europe is taken in the middle of a big process of transformation, and I believe that Europe will need to adapt pretty quickly if it doesn't want to be left behind in this new multipolar order that I think we will kind of observe and witness becoming more and more stronger in future years.
But under such a security environment, very close defense alliances, such as NATO, for instance, in Europe, what kind of role would you expect NATO to play? Because it seems to me that at least we have a bit of a consensus that the world is opening up and there are more, let's say, large actors playing in something to play and to claim a role at the table, right? So under these circumstances, to what extent NATO is still relevant? For instance, in Europe, whereas you have the OSCE, that is by far the most overarching, the most democratic, and the most encompassing international organizations that would be by far responding to the current challenges.
I believe this is an institution that was set up in the early days of the Cold War to answer to the logic of containment, to the fear that if the Soviet Union had not been faced somehow with a strong response from the West, then Europe could have moved from one devil to another in the space of a few years. And of course, when the Soviet bloc imploded, when the Soviet Union disappeared, there were calls maybe to reform or to disband NATO itself. And I have to say that this organization has been very resilient and has shown a capability to adapt throughout the years, maybe not fully to the changing international circumstances, but still to an extent it has been much more successful than other alliances that were set up, like in other multipolar or bipolar phases of the international system. But maybe NATO has got like an advantage on its side. It was never defined as closely as a purely military alliance. Both on the European and on the American side, I think there was an intent also to develop NATO as a community, to transform it into a community in which member states would not only coordinate the military and defense policies, but also the economic policies, the social policies, and would try to integrate one another. And I think President Kennedy in the 1960s made it clear that Article 2 was as important as Article 5, making sure that NATO really turned into like a community of intent among its member states. And I believe that this is this commonality that allowed NATO to survive the end of the Cold War, allow NATO to survive bipolarity, and allow NATO to retain, as you told me, and as under everybody's eyes, a primary role in European security. But if I have to give maybe a final hint or a final message on this question, now NATO has gone back to what it was its original role, like there is emphasis on the need to reinforce collective security, deterrence, Article 5. Well, I don't think this will be enough to extend the lifespan on NATO. I think the alliance should continue to undergo a process of transformation, should also retain a political and a communitarian side alongside this defense dimension. And I believe that this will require sustaining dialogue also with the other parts, especially with a country that, willing or not, belongs to Europe, that willing or not was part of the initial concern of NATO, Russia.
Mm-hmm. Despite the fact that the Lisbon Treaty has been giving a lot of substance to the common foreign and security policy, elevating the institutionalization process when it comes to getting together member states and trying to coordinate at the supranational level the foreign policy. It's still, there is an article there, if I'm not mistaken, Article 4, I think, that says that at the end of the day, security remains the responsibility of the member states. Under such circumstances, how would the EU, to what extent would the EU be capable to respond as a unitary actor to any threats, to any military threats, to any security vulnerabilities from outside the EU? And I would just like to make reference to 3 notable events, and one would go back to 2005, if I would be correct. And this is that back to 2005 there was an initiative. There was Chirac and Schroeder, and there was a Russian guy, and they were about to strike an alliance or a sort of understanding, security understanding, to keep the Americans out and have a common understanding when it comes to security. That would be moment number 1. Moment number 2 would be the proposal to have this PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. And the third one would be the Macron Initiative, European Intervention Initiative. And then we have the fourth now with Poland willing and inviting the American to settle down permanent troops in Poland. And that would be very much against the founding NATO and Russia Act that goes back to 1997, that both sides, NATO committed not to establish permanent troops in the former Soviet space. So under these circumstances, what kind of role would the EU be capable to play? Often the EU was called like being an economic giant, a political worm, and a military dwarf. So how would you assess the EU into that?
I think, if I'm not wrong, like the original one was that the European Union was meant to be like an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm, so lacking completely like any military relevance. And for most of the Cold War, I believe that this relevance was almost unneeded, or many European member states felt that after all, their security would only be guaranteed through Article 5 of NATO, and that the European community back in those days should mainly deal with economic, financial issues once the military side had been put the military issue had been put to the side. And I think like to clarify what role the EU can play, we can't forget and we have like somehow to recall how this debate evolved during the Cold War, and especially like as you mentioned Macron, as you mentioned the French, like the big blow that the European project took in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s, when France, after having launched the idea of a European defense community, decided to backtrack because the French themselves felt that they were not ready to share military sovereignty, defense sovereignty with the other nations of the European communities, well, the European defense communities, of course, back in those days as the EEC didn't exist yet. So I think this was like already like a turning point, was the turning point that made NATO the bedrock of Western European security for the rest of the Cold War, and it is a turning point, the consequences of which were felt also in the 1990s and also in the early 2000s. There have been like a number of attempts going back to the time of the Maastricht Treaty, but then again with the Saint-Malo Anglo-French summit, like to relaunch this European idea, and maybe to make sure that a European soul in Europe, like that was pretty much the French dream from the early days of this project, could be reconciled with the Atlantic instead dimension that in Europe was pretty much embodied by the position of Great Britain. This has happened to an extent, and the Lisbon Treaty, especially in 2007, and later on the initiatives that have followed up from this treaty up to the PESCO that you just mentioned, have partially managed like to solve this issue. But I think that there has been, until now, for a number of reasons, including the consequences of the economic crisis in 2008, like a tendency by the European countries to dodge responsibility in security and defense and to hope that maybe somebody else would do like the dirty job for them. Only a few months ago, to Angela Merkel, she reminded us that maybe those golden days when others were doing the dirty job for the Europeans are gone, and maybe the Europeans now they will have to take their destiny into their own hands. I still retain a little bit of doubts about the willingness and the capability of the European Union, though in its current institutional form, to play a meaningful security role. I believe that this will require like a significant reform of the European institutions. And Macron has put forward now some other initiatives, but I am doubtful like how far his view are actually shared by the European partners, and my doubts concern especially like the position of Germany. I believe that without like a determined German belief or a determined German drive to reinforce like the role of an independent European security framework, all the other initiatives, going back to the one taken by Chirac and Schröder after the Iraqi division, or those that were thought of by Mitterrand and even before by de Gaulle, are still bound like to fail and not to change the current security dynamics on the continent. But I'm not sure whether we want Germany like to become a more powerful actor, security actor in Europe. And I believe this is like a vision that is shared in the United States and is as much shared also like across maybe the new Iron Curtain in Russia.
Assuming we are moving towards polycentrism, and we know from that what follows, there would be a lot of chaos and a lot of instability. And God's sake, there are like there's like tones of factuality that the instability, it is already there. Europe is not, the EU is not able to act as a unitary actor when it comes to security. What would middle-sized powers like Italy or small powers, small countries like Romania, how they are supposed to act?
That's another very interesting question. I think like in time of shifting sands, middle and small powers, they usually have a choice. Either they go like for preserving the status quo and maybe improving it, or they go like for revisionist ambitions. And Italy and Romania, despite the differences, they have some common historical legacy together. There's been a time in history when we try like to gain more at the time of shifting sands, and then we were left like in trouble at the end of it. So I believe that the lesson of history that has taught to Italian and Romanian decision makers probably a lot should also teach them about the importance of avoiding, first of all, becoming marginalized, but secondly also the importance of avoiding becoming entrapped into crises in which actually their own national interests, their own national status could be further undermined. So for them, I believe it is fundamental, like first of all, to emphasize the importance of multilateralism, which means to keep a seat at the table, but this seat at the table must be used not like to make selfish gains, but actually like to push the others to create a more just international system, a more democratic international system, and a more cooperative way of solving disputes. And I believe that the experience, at least of the Cold War, can teach like to Italy and Romania, although they were like on both sides for a long time, pretty much the importance of multilateralism. And this is the benefit, I believe, that to understand NATO, but even more so like the European Union, and left as a legacy of, left as an historical legacy of this multilateralism. International organizations are needed to de-escalate tensions, to force great powers pretty much to respect the rules of the game, or a game that should have become more democratic and more just. And I believe this is what Italy and Romania should stand for. So they should stand like for a system of values, for a system of engagement, for a system of dialogue among the great powers, rather than simply like taking stands or maybe pursuing their old national ambitions. So I don't think there should be like a return to the past.
But if we take into account the fact that there is not that much of an appetite, both on the American side, but also on the side of some European great powers, there is not that much of an appetite for transatlanticism. If we take into account that there's China marching towards Europe and Russia articulating more substantially to play a decisive role, and it's not going to be on an equal partnership, it's not going to be on an equal footing, what kind of role would be still Italy and Romania to play? Italy is playing already a critical role when it comes to China Belt and Road Initiative. Romania has been so far, to some extent, marginalizing itself. So under these circumstances, what kind of input could both countries bring?
The input that medium and most small powers can play is an input that must go towards making sure that the shifting sense of international politics will not lead us to a new polarization of international relations, be this at the bipolar or the multipolar level. Because countries like Italy and Romania are the medium powers, of course, they run the risk of turning once more into satellites. There were times during the Cold War when Italy was referred to as the Bulgaria of NATO. And of course, this is like a condition in which the Italians or the Romanians, probably not even the Bulgarians, would like to find themselves in. This again emphasizes, I believe, the importance of multilateralism, the importance of international institutions, the importance of fostering dialogue, even among different poles, even among NATO and Russia, even among the European Union and Russia, and of course, even among the Euro-Atlantic institutions and China. This means, of course, creating like a bigger Eurasian space that includes, of course, the Atlantic, includes the United States, but that is open to engagement also like with countries that in past phases of history were considered to be enemies of the West.
And that would be the very last one. If we assume that that China is moving for real, and that we get this Eurasia space expanding towards Europe, then implicitly the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would be neighboring NATO, right? So under these circumstances, either you get a clash in between the two. A second scenario would be you take OECE as being the very legitimized organization, international organization, not to take sides and to be a neutral player, to by far be more of a better facilitator, or you envisage a third international architecture to handle security in Europe. What would be taken on that?
Well, I believe the risk of this transformation of international politics or European politics turning into like a confrontation between like whatever is left to the West and Russian Chinese understanding is very unlikely. First of all, because I believe that Russia doesn't have like a fundamental interest in embracing China fully, and in turning maybe one day into a vassal or a satellite of a China that, as you were saying, is advancing very fast, very rapidly, even up into Europe, even up into Africa. This means that for Europe, it is fundamental to keep alive those institutions, as I said, they were set during the Cold War, but also like not just as defense institution, also as a system of values. It is fundamental to reform them, but it is as fundamental like to engage, to dialogue also with the others. This is like a fundamental element, I believe, to make sure that polarization will not take place. It is a fundamental element to make sure that a new competitive multipolar system will not emerge. I don't believe that we are heading towards bipolarity for the reasons that I just mentioned, but we may be heading towards an unstable multipolarity which will not benefit anybody, I believe.